abajo. Hemos dado la orden a las fuerzas de defensa israelíes de preparar una ofensiva en Rafah, así como en 2 campamentos de refugiados, los últimos bastiones restantes de Hamás. Miramos de nuevo a Estados Unidos. Se ha confirmado la muerte de 5 marines estadounidenses después de que su helicóptero se estrellara en un área remota en las afueras de San Diego mientras realizaban un vuelo de entrenamiento durante una feroz tormenta invernal. Es lo que ha dicho este jueves el Cuerpo de Marines de Estados Unidos. Su helicóptero CH-53E Super Stallion se estrelló en Pine Valley, una zona montañosa remota al este de la ciudad, este martes por la noche, cuando se dirigían a la estación aérea del Cuerpo de Marines en Miramar, California, según ha dicho el Cuerpo de Marines en un comunicado. Miramos también a Pakistán. El Ministerio del Interior ha cortado este jueves el servicio de telefonía móvil en todo Pakistán, una decisión denunciada como fundamentalmente antidemocrática por NetBlocks, una organización que supervisa la ciberseguridad y la gobernanza de Internet. El gobierno anunció la suspensión temporal de este servicio por motivos de seguridad tras el doble atentado del grupo Estado Islámico que causó 28 muertos en la provincia suroccidental de Baluchistán. Miramos ahora a España. Ha arrancado la tercera jornada de protestas consecutivas del campo español. Este jueves se han vuelto a producir tractoradas en decenas de carreteras de toda la geografía española, así como actos de bloqueo a las puertas de nudos logísticos y de transporte. Además, en algunos puntos de España también ha comenzado el calendario oficial de protestas convocadas por las organizaciones agrarias, ya que las marchas actuales se han organizado de forma independiente vía WhatsApp y Telegram. Ha destacado la escalada en Cataluña, donde los agricultores han conseguido entrar a la Gran Vía de Barcelona. No obstante, el sector agrario prevé que el momento álgido va a llegar este sábado, cuando miles de agricultores y transportistas que comienzan su paro indefinido este sábado quieren llegar a Madrid y llegar a Ferraz para reclamar soluciones inmediatas ante la sede del PSOE. Miramos ahora al Pleno del Parlamento Europeo. Ha aprobado este jueves por abrumadora mayoría la esperada resolución sobre la injerencia rusa y los esfuerzos para desestabilizar a la Unión Europea, sembrando caos en los distintos Estados miembros o apoyando a partidos políticos o movimientos como el independentismo catalán. Un texto que pide seguir investigando el papel del entorno de Carles Puigdemont y que deplora la presión sobre los magistrados que lo están haciendo. El resultado ha sido abrumador: 433 votos a favor, 56 en contra y 18 abstenciones. La frase que más ha llamado la atención ha sido la de que piden a las autoridades judiciales competentes que investiguen eficazmente las conexiones de eurodiputados con el Kremlin. Miramos ahora al presidente ruso Vladimir Putin y al presidente chino Xi Jinping. Han hablado por teléfono y ambos han rechazado lo que llaman interferencia estadounidense en los asuntos de otros países. Es lo que ha dicho este jueves el asesor del Kremlin, Yuri Usakov. Ambos líderes han dicho que su política exterior estará dirigida a crear un orden mundial multipolar y más justo, añadiendo que los planes para visitas recíprocas y reuniones personales entre Putin y Xi Jinping estaban fuera de discusión por ahora. También han discutido la situación en Ucrania y la resolución del conflicto en Oriente Medio y han acordado continuar los contactos bilaterales. Pendientes de las noticias, de la actualidad, también de todo lo que sucede, todo lo que acontece en directo, vamos precisamente a conectar con António Guterres. Ayer hablaba de que el mundo entra en la era del caos. Lo escuchamos.
The need for peace in all its dimensions, because peace is the tie that binds. But too often we face instead a Gordian knot. On issues of peace and security, we face rising conflict and geopolitical divisions. On issues of peace within communities, we see rising polarization. On issues of peace with justice, we have rising inequalities. On issues of peace with nature, we are rising global emissions and global temperatures. We are at a moment of truce, but we have a breakdown of trust. Trust in institutions, trust in leaders, and also trust in governments and multilateral institutions. Now, the way to restore trust is by making a real and positive difference in people's lives, solving people's problems. Yesterday, I presented a clear-eyed, sober assessment of the world. This is no time for pulling punches. We have a number of existential challenges: the age-old nuclear threat, the climate emergency, and the dangers posed by unchecked artificial intelligence. But we are not sufficiently united and organized to respond effectively to any of them. On top of that, we face a multiplication of conflicts and geopolitical divides. Much can be done across the board to end conflict, to effectively address threats posed by artificial intelligence, to take climate action, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But it will require a serious conversation between developed and developing countries, between rich and emerging economies, between North and South, East and West.
Pendientes de las declaraciones de António Guterres, secretario general de la ONU, que está hablando de que la polarización está creciendo alrededor del mundo, está hablando de los conflictos geopolíticos que estamos viviendo en estos momentos y ojo porque ha dicho no estamos lo suficientemente organizados como para responder a todos estos conflictos, a todos estos problemas a la vez. No estamos capacitados ni organizados en estos momentos. Le seguimos escuchando.
When multipolarity is not accompanied by effective, renewed and inclusive mechanisms of multilateral governments, the risks multiply. So this is a year for focusing on the future, and we have our Summit of the Future in September. And this is a year for focusing on people's challenge also today. We have institutions that need to be aligned with our times. And we have principles to guide us that we must preserve in all situations. Respect for the United Nations Charter. Respect for international law and international humanitarian law. Peace with justice that addresses inequalities. Following those principles will lead us to the pathways to solutions that I laid out yesterday. The new agenda for peace, the SDG stimulus, the Global Digital Compact, the work of the Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence, the Climate Solidarity Pact, and much more. And on the peace and security front, I believe it is especially critical to find solutions to two burning conflicts that are having profound global consequences, Ukraine and Gaza. This month marks the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is essential that we work for a just and sustainable peace, but a peace in line with the UN Charter and with international law. And in Gaza, the situation just keeps getting worse. In addition to the deaths and destruction from military operations, starvation and disease are bearing down on Palestinians in Gaza. Despite some limited steps, our humanitarian operations continue to face denials of access, delays, impediments, and multiple dangers, including live fire. One of our convoys was damaged by Israeli naval artillery earlier this week, and just 10 out of 61 planned 8 convoys to the north reached their destination in January. Let's be clear. Denial of humanitarian access means denial of humanitarian relief for civilians. Food and water are needed for a desperate population.
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres, que está pidiendo respeto para la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, también para el derecho humanitario. Dice Guterres que es crítico, que es necesario encontrar ya una solución para el conflicto en Ucrania, también para el conflicto en Gaza. Ha hecho especial hincapié en que la situación en Gaza es cada vez peor, hablando del hambre, hablando de la situación que están viviendo los palestinos en estos momentos y además también en última instancia sigue hablando de la falta de entrada de ayuda humanitaria a la franja de Gaza. Dice Guterres que denegar la entrada de ayuda humanitaria a Gaza es hacer que básicamente los palestinos se mueran de hambre. Seguimos escuchando a Guterres hablando de los conflictos geopolíticos que hay en estos momentos y la necesidad de encontrar una solución.
Of civilians and ensuring that essential needs are met. We were clear in condemning the horrific acts of Hamas. We are also clear in condemning the violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. We need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We need it for the immediate. We need also the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. And we need real, visible, concrete steps towards a two-state solution based on UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. Repeated bloody hostilities and decades of tensions and occupation have failed to provide a state for the Palestinians or security for Israelis. In the Middle East and around the world, we need peace in every sense. Our world cannot afford to wait, and I thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you. Before we go to questions, a couple of ground rules, which I say every time. Please limit yourself to one question. Thank you. We have our wonderful interpreters in the back for Spanish and French, in case the Secretary General asks answers those questions in that language. We'll take a few questions. Please just no Super Bowl Taylor Swift questions. So, Valeria, all yours.
Thank you, Secretary General, on behalf of ANCA for this press conference. It's always good to see you here. So my question is on Gaza. Yesterday, the Israeli Prime Minister rejects the Hamas proposed ceasefire terms and said that a total victory in Gaza is possible within months. So it looks that Israel does not have the willingness to consider or accept any negotiated deal. Is there any hope?
Ha empezado la ronda de preguntas para António Guterres. De momento el enfoque se está centrando en Gaza y precisamente el propio Guterres estaba hablando en los últimos minutos sobre la situación en Palestina. Dice que, que ha condenado en múltiples ocasiones los horribles ataques de Hamas, pero insiste en que necesitamos un alto el fuego inmediato, en el que la liberación de los rehenes debe ser también inmediata y que hay que encontrar una solución. Él alude a la solución de los dos estados. Seguimos escuchando a Guterres contestando respuestas sobre la situación en Gaza.
The negotiations will be able to go on, and that those negotiations might lead to a breakthrough in relation both to different periods of cessation of hostilities and to the liberation of hostages. For me, the question of the liberation of hostages is absolutely essential from the human point of view. I had the possibility to receive several hostages, two hostages in Davos, families of hostages and people knowing them, and I know what the suffering is related to that. So when we have a negotiation in which the release of hostages is in one hand, and in which different aspects of pauses, ceasefires, or restoring calm, several different kinds of language were used. When there is a negotiation of this nature, I think it's in the interest of everybody. And it's in the particular interest of the government of Israel to make sure that these negotiations are successful.
Thank you. Edie Lederer, Associated Press.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General.
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres. Le han preguntado por las negociaciones entre Israel y Hamas y vuelve a insistir, vuelve a incidir. Dice Guterres, la liberación de los rehenes es necesaria, es inmediata y sobre todo dice, lo necesitamos desde un punto de vista humano. Dice además, pues que el sufrimiento de estas personas está siendo increíble y que además en estos momentos tenemos una negociación y dice Guterres que el principal beneficiado, el principal interesado en que haya una negociación exitosa, en que se consiga una liberación de rehenes, debe ser Israel. Seguimos escuchando.
To halt these atrocities.
First of all, we need to fully support the ICC. And I believe the role of the ICC and in particular the creation of conditions for prosecution of those involved in these atrocities is absolutely essential. On the other hand, we are working with IGAD and with the African Union and the Arab League. I hope I will have the occasion to meet with all of them again in the African Union Summit next week to see how we can converge our efforts to bring these two generals to the table, to have a ceasefire, and to finally create the conditions also for effective humanitarian aid to be distributed to a people that is in a desperate condition. What is happening is horrible. It needs to stop. And we need to mobilize the whole of the international community, the neighbors, the countries that have influence on both parties to do everything possible to stop these horrible atrocities. There is no military solution for Sudan. They can go on fighting for on, and that, of course, will not bring any solution, so we must stop this as soon as possible.
Sherwin, then Kirsten.
Sherwin Rice, please. Sherman Bryce for South African Broadcasting, SG. We have not heard you, in your own words, reflect on the International Court of Justice case brought by South Africa against Israel and the subsequent provisional orders that were handed down. What do you make of the case? What do you make of the court's provisional decisions and the lack of compliance we are all bearing witness to in Gaza today? And in that regard, what is your message to Palestinians trapped in Gaza who have all but lost hope?
First of all, we fully support the International Court of Justice. We think the International Court of Justice is the right entity to pronounce itself on these issues. We fully support the decisions of the International Court of Justice, and we clearly express that all those decisions must be implemented. And so it is absolutely essential that all the decisions are implemented. And obviously, I have full confidence in the International Court of Justice to be able to act if those decisions are not properly implemented. You had a second?
Your message to the people of Gaza.
My message to the people of Gaza is a message of total solidarity and total commitment. Solidarity with their horrible suffering, commitment to do everything to mobilize the UN system to provide the possible assistance we can provide, and at the same time to go on with a very active global advocacy for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to take place.
Kirsten, Salome.
Escuchando a António Guterres, que vuelve a insistir, vuelve a pedir un cese inmediato, un alto el fuego inmediato. Está hablando, bueno, de nuevo de la situación en Gaza. Dice que lo que está pasando que es horrible y que debe parar ya. Dice que apoyan además la decisión de la Corte Internacional de Justicia. Dice que apoyan todas sus decisiones, pero sobre todo insiste en que deben ser implementadas, en que deben cerciorarse, deben asegurarse de que estas decisiones se implementan correctamente en Israel. Y en el caso de que no sea así, en el caso de que no se estén implementando, deben actuar. Alude a la decisión por parte de la Corte Internacional de Justicia y, sobre todo, a que deben asegurarse de que Israel cumpla todo lo impuesto.
In contravention of UN Security Council Resolution 2712, 2720, and the ICJ ruling.
I've said clearly that we are witnessing violations of international humanitarian law, and those violations must stop.
Ibtisam Azam.
Thank you. Here. Thank you. My name is Ibtisam.
By the way, not only by Israel.
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have also a question on Gaza, and the question is regarding the role that the U.S. is playing. Do you believe that, given the fact that the U.S. has a very strong relationship with the Israeli government, that they are using the leverage they should do, or the fact that they are giving or planning to give about $17 billion for weapons makes them actually party to the conflict and not a separate, not an independent. What's your position on that, and what's your message to the American administration? Thank you.
Everybody knows that Israel is that the United States is an ally of Israel. That has been said time and time again by all leaders in the United States and in Israel. So that is clear. It's a country that is ally. But it is also true, and I can testify it myself, that there has been a lot of pressure by the United States in relation to Israel in different areas of humanitarian aid. I remember several phone calls of President Biden to Prime Minister Netanyahu to solve problems that we had on the ground and couldn't solve by ourselves. And I can also testify that there has been a clear pressure of the United States in order for full respect of international humanitarian law. But that doesn't change the fact that, indeed, the United States is an ally of Israel.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you believe that just a quick follow-up. Do you believe that they are doing everything in their power to use that leverage? Also, given the fact that
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres. Le han preguntado que si Estados Unidos ya es directamente parte de este conflicto, no que sea independiente, no solo que esté apoyando a Israel, sino que esté participando directamente en esta guerra de Israel. Dice el propio Guterres, bueno, pues que es evidente que Estados Unidos e Israel son aliados, que eso está claro y que todo el mundo lo sabe, pero sin embargo matiza, dice que Estados Unidos, y que además él ha sido testigo de ello, que ha estado presionando a Israel primero para la entrada de ayuda humanitaria, luego también para que cumpla el derecho internacional y bueno, dice pues que es evidente que ambos son aliados, pero que Estados Unidos está intentando llevarle por el buen camino, dice Guterres, pues que está intentando por lo menos que respeten, que cumplan el derecho internacional. Seguimos escuchando de nuevo esta comparecencia.
Of democracy are being sacrificed on the altar of our number one priority, which is security. What do you think of that trend that's playing out across the continent? I think that there is a widespread trend, not only on the American continent, but a little bit elsewhere across the world, a trend whereby we're seeing populism and polarization gain ground, and the rising tide of populism and polarization, in my opinion, constitute a threat to the normal functioning of democratic institutions, which we all wish to see.
Why not?
Thank you very much for doing this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Daniel Ederson from Ynet, from Israel. I wanted to ask if you also have a message to the Israeli people, considering all the criticism that you're facing from the public in Israel. What is your message to the Israeli people, considering your message to the Israeli people, considering how much criticism you're facing in the country?
Well, I am a politician that has a long history of relations with Israel. I was elected vice president of the Social International the same day in the same Congress as Isaac Rabin was elected. And I remember that one of my first visits is when I was elected leader of the Socialist Party in Portugal was to visit Rabin and Perez, at the time were Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister of Israel. Later, when I was Prime Minister, I had the occasion, Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat had not the chance to meet in New York, the time of the government of Sharon. They met in my office in Lisbon for 4 hours with me and the former Prime Minister of Norway, Thorbjørn Jagland. So I've always been very closely committed to support all those that in Israel were defending the Israeli interests, but also committed to peace in relation to the Middle East. On the other hand, as Prime Minister of Portugal, I approved and made the Parliament approve the decree that revoked the edict of expulsion that the Portuguese did in the early 16th century in the most criminal and stupid act of the history of my country when the Jewish community was expelled. We revoked that edict, and I went myself to the Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam, by the way, an absolutely fantastic temple, unfortunately almost desert because of the Holocaust, to deposit that law. And today, as you are probably aware, tens of thousands of descendants of that community are gaining Portuguese nationality. And there are even citizens of Israel that are moving from Israel to Portugal. On the other hand, I was always a very strong supporter of all efforts in order to create the conditions for full security of the people of Israel and of the state of Israel, and at the same time for the creation of a Palestinian state, allowing for the two countries to live side by side in peace. When Hamas attacked with that absolutely intolerable terror attacks, I was very strong condemning it. I was also very strong in asking since the beginning and repeatedly for the immediate and the unconditional release of hostages. And when there were indications that Hamas had infiltrated UNRWA, I acted immediately in order to guarantee that we do whatever is necessary for UNRWA to be able to avoid any kind of infiltration by Hamas. But it is also true that I believe we need a two-state solution, and I disagree with the policies of the government of Israel, with the settlements and with a number of other initiatives that have undermined the two-state solution. And I've also expressed my opinion that the way the military operations are being conducted in Gaza has been with an absolutely unacceptable excess of people being killed and of destruction. So my message to the people of Israel is that I will always be a strong supporter of the right of Israel to live in peace and security. I've always been a committed fighter against anti-Semitism, but I'm also totally committed to work for the Palestinians to be able to have their own state and to have their self-determination recognized and to the end of occupation.
Benno, then Deji.
Thank you. Benno Schwingheimer with the German press agency.
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres bastante enfadado en su discurso. Dice que está creciendo el populismo a nivel mundial. Ojo, porque dice Guterres, el auge mundial del populismo y la polarización está amenazando las instituciones democráticas. Le han pedido también que mande un mensaje a Israel y, bueno, ha sido un mensaje bastante largo, prácticamente 2 o 3 minutos, hablando de su experiencia con Israel. Dice que siempre ha defendido los intereses de Israel, pero que sobre todo defiende la paz en Oriente Medio. Dice que es inaceptable la gente que ha fallecido en este conflicto y que además está comprometido con trabajar para que los palestinos tengan su propio Estado. Seguimos escuchando a Guterres.
You are dealing with a high risk. And when we are dealing with high risk, and you have rules and regulations that allow you to do so, you, I believe, should do what I did, which was to terminate immediately the contracts based on the so-called best interests of the organization, which is what the rules and regulations allow me to do. At the same time, the investigation team was immediately on the ground. And if I have made any mistake, it can be corrected in the future. But we couldn't run the risk not to act immediately, as the accusations were related to criminal activities that are really dangerous. And I must say, I'm a little bit surprised when I now read in the press that apparently the military were not willing, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel, to convey that information to us. And even worse, I read in the press that in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they didn't expect me to act. I mean, I can't imagine that this was a trap. One thing that you can be absolutely sure, any allegation that is presented to us by the government of Israel in relation to any other infiltration of Hamas in the UN, at whatever level, we will act immediately upon it.
Deji?
Xu Dezhi with China Central Television. First, 春节快乐, Happy New Year. But obviously, this is a
Happy New Year.
difficult year for you, I think. With so many,
Year of the Dragon.
yeah, with so many Security Council resolutions not implemented, with the acquisitions on UN institutions like UNRWA and governments asking to keep peacekeeping missions, there are more and more doubts on the effectiveness of the UN, especially on maintaining stability and security of the world. What can you say to them? What do you want to have in 2024?
Well, first of all, let's separate things. One thing is the Security Council. And in relation to the Security Council, I said yesterday that the Security Council has been largely paralyzed and that it has been divided and probably now more divided than ever. I have not yet finished. Another thing, you mentioned UNRWA. I mean, of course, there were accusations in relation to the infiltration of Hamas, in relation to UNRWA and to acts like what the ones mentioned. But let's not forget that we have more than 30,000 workers of UNRWA providing humanitarian aid, but also schooling, health, other forms of community support in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And that in Gaza, we have, from the operational point of view of the emergency, beyond the workers that were in schools, and we have 3,000 people that are the backbone of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. So independently of everything that has happened and acting in relation to that with clear determination, I think it's important to say that the humanitarian work that the UN does in the world is unique, irreplaceable, and a source of pride for all of us. And it should not be confused with the difficult of decisions of the Security Council.
Yeah, but the thing is, I asked about the Security Council resolutions. They are not implemented. They cannot. I mean, there are doubts that whether the UN should be.
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres. Ojo a la pregunta que le acaban de plantear. Ha empezado diciéndole que, bueno, que pensaba que iba a ser un año complicado para el propio António Guterres y le ha preguntado por la utilidad del Consejo de Seguridad y también de la URWA. Dice que hay muchas dudas en torno, bueno, pues a estas dos organizaciones, en torno a estas dos entidades y que qué mensaje puede lanzar, cómo puede justificar la validez de las mismas. Dice Guterres que el Consejo de Seguridad está más dividido que nunca, que él mismo lo admitió en el día de ayer y que, bueno, pues que tienen que intentar solucionarlo de alguna forma, pero sin embargo dice que son dos cosas diferentes, que la URWA es diferente. Dice Guterres que independientemente de esto es importante decir que la labor humanitaria de la URWA es única e imprescindible. Sigue justificándose Guterres explicando para qué sirven tanto la ONU como el Consejo de Seguridad como la URWA. Lo escuchamos.
Around the world, obviously, we are having an extreme difficulty in having Security Council resolutions being implemented. With united Security Council, with the most important powers of the world able to work together, with more clarity in power relations, there will be more respect and there will be less capacity of people to go on doing what they do in total impunity and to the detriment of the suffering of millions of people around the world.
Maggie, then Pam.
Secretary General, Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. 2 years this month since Russia invaded Ukraine. Do you worry that the fighting will continue while Moscow waits to see who wins the U.S. election in November?
Independently of the US elections, independently of everything else, I think it's important to say that from our side, because we have no control of anything in the elections in the US or even in the battlefield, from our side, we will go on doing everything we can for peace, and the peace based in the UN Charter and peace based in international law.
Pam?
Thank you, Secretary General. It's good to have a briefing. Thank you for being here. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. Big picture question based on a lot of what you said yesterday and questions. As you know, the UN's credibility around the world is at an all-time low. And that's because of what you said. There's more conflicts in the world than there have been since 1945. You have a summit of the future, you're looking for proposals, but generally speaking, do you believe that the UN can still, in this day and age, bring peace to the conflicts you're looking at, Ukraine, Gaza and Israel, and everything else, Sudan and everything else we're looking at? Thank you.
I am the first to say that the United Nations, namely the Security Council, the Bretton Woods Institution, and different other multilateral organizations created after the Second World War are today outdated, they are dysfunctional, and they are unfair, and they need to be reformed. And I will do everything I can in the context of the Summit of the Future to push as much as possible for the reform of our own institutions and for asking for the reform of other institutions. And so it is clear that there is a dysfunctionality in relation to the reality of today's world and the nature of the multilateral organizations like the UN. Having said so, I've just seen a survey in relation to credibility in the world of different entities. And the UN is still clearly above, for instance, governments.
Linda, then Una.
Thank you, Secretary General. Linda Fasulo, NPR at the UN. My question involves...
Seguimos escuchando a Guterres. Le han vuelto a preguntar por todos los conflictos geopolíticos que hay en estos momentos, hablando de Gaza, de Ucrania, de Sudán. Le han preguntado si la credibilidad de la ONU está en sus horas más bajas. Dice Guterres que ya habló de esto precisamente en los últimos días, en las últimas horas. Dice, bueno, pues que la situación está totalmente descontrolada, que estamos en un momento de conflicto pues que no veía desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial y que está demostrando que muchas de estas entidades son disfuncionales y que básicamente que se han quedado obsoletas. Dice Guterres que desde su posición va a empujar todo lo que pueda para solucionar esto, para conseguir de nuevo esta credibilidad, dice, pero no solo de la ONU, también del resto de instituciones. He terminado bromeando. Dice, a pesar de todo esto, vi una encuesta hace poco que dice que todavía tenemos más credibilidad que los gobiernos. Bueno, seguimos escuchándole.
Everybody to establish it immediately, but I know how things are. I've been in politics a long period of my life, and I know how politics play in governments, in parliaments, in public opinions, everywhere, and I understand the concerns that exist. And so what we are doing is to do the right thing in order to give the guarantees that these countries would like to have, that we are doing everything possible to make sure that UNRWA is an organization that not only is effective, necessary, but it is also able to defend itself against infiltrations that can put into question its neutrality. And we are doing everything in that direction. And in my context, I'm hopeful that countries will recognize that efforts and that progressively this problem will be solved.
Una, then Yvonne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General.
Una in the back, right?
Oh, thank you. Una Labes on Channel 12 News, Israel. You have said also in recent days that the Israeli military operation is a collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza. And because you acknowledge a brutal attack by Hamas, you've condemned it just now. I have to ask you as a former head of state, what is the expectation? What can be done when a terrorist organization invades and murders another state? And on that note, isn't it time for the UN, as other countries, the US, European countries, recognize Hamas as a terror organization?
Well, the recognition of terrorist organizations is done by the Security Council in the United Nations. So I said very clearly that what we had was terror attacks. So I think it's absolutely clear my position about those attacks. But now let's go to your question. And your question is, for me, very simple. Those attacks were horrible. But as different Israeli leaders have been telling repeatedly, they are not fighting the Palestinian people, they are fighting Hamas. If that is the case, I cannot understand how this is conducted in such a way that has led in Gaza to reportedly around 28,000 people killed, to 75% of the population displaced, and to a level of destruction of entire neighborhoods at the level that it has happened. I think that there is something wrong in the way the military operations are being conducted.
But you know how Hamas is inside the civilian.
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres, siguen preguntándole por la situación en Gaza, también por la situación en torno a la UNRWA. Ha vuelto a defenderla, dice que es efectiva, necesaria y que puede defenderse por sí misma. Dice Guterres, bueno, está hablando del castigo colectivo por parte de Israel y también el hecho de reconocer a Hamas como una organización terrorista. Dice Guterres que en muchas ocasiones ya ha reiterado que estos eran ataques terroristas y que hay muchos países ya que están reconociendo a Hamas como una organización terrorista, pero dice, una vez más, reitera que los ataques fueron horribles, pero que lo que él no entiende ha sido la respuesta por parte de Israel, que no entiende por qué han tenido que matar y desplazar a tanta gente.
Eucerin Hialuron Filler Elasticity. Reduce las manchas de la edad con Thiamidol. 92% piel más joven en 2 semanas. Ya tienes tu tratamiento antiedad a un precio especial.
Same thing today.
I think they were both extremely sad. I can't compare the sadness of both situations.
You, kill the news?
Thank you for Secretary General. So my name is Yu from Kyoto News, Japanese news agency. So my question is about North Korea, DPRK. So as you know, North Korea launched missiles so many times, and then the relationship with neighbor like Japan and Korea is getting worse. So what do you think about the North Korea issue?
I strongly condemn any violations of sanctions. I strongly condemn any attempts of North Korea to launch missiles or to develop nuclear weapons. I think it's absolutely essential that North Korea abides by the same Security Council resolutions that unfortunately we have discussed in a previous question are sometimes difficult to implement. But all those things that you mentioned are, from our perspective, totally unacceptable. As it is unacceptable, for instance, the maintenance of hostages for decades without proper information if they are alive, if they died, to their families. I'm talking about the Japanese that were hijacked by North Korea.
Thank you. Ephraim, Celia, and then Marta.
Thank you so much. My name is Ephraim Kosaifi from Arab News Daily. A lot is being said about the role that the Secretary General has to play in this conflict. Some people expect you to say certain words, to act in a certain way. A lot is being said about it and analyzed. According to you, how do you see your role in this, and the fact that all your calls, all your pleas for a ceasefire, for food to enter Gaza, for medicine, for everything you've been saying have fallen on deaf ears, and there's no movement on the ground. In the light of all of that, did that push you maybe to re-examine, reflect on the role of the Secretary General in a crisis like this and in the world we're living in today? And if so, what is your vision about that? And what are the forces that are stopping you from doing your job? Thank you.
That is my worst frustration, to see suffering at such a large scale and to know that I have not the power to stop it. But it is a reality. I have not the power to stop it. I can raise my voice, and I do it. I can sometimes convene, but people need to be willing to be convened. But indeed, the biggest frustration I have is not to have the power to end these conflicts we have been discussing, or at least to create the conditions for people to respect international law and international humanitarian law.
Celia, then Marta, and then Sirife.
Seguimos escuchando a António Guterres. Está hablando también de la situación en Corea del Norte, de las pruebas de misiles. Dice Guterres que es totalmente inaceptable, que lo condena, no solo las pruebas con misiles, sino también dice que, bueno, que es totalmente inaceptable cómo están intentando ir acumulando armas nucleares. Habla también de su situación, de su cargo. Dice que lo más frustrante para él es saber pues, que hay mucha gente sufriendo y que no tiene el poder para solucionarlo. Dice que su poder llega hasta el punto de intentar convencer a la gente, pero que esa gente debe dejarse convencer, y habla, bueno, pues de que la situación, los conflictos geopolíticos en estos momentos le entristecen profundamente. Seguimos escuchando de nuevo la comparecencia de Guterres.
A future that resembles the present.
Amelie.
Hi, my name is Marta Moreira.
Sorry. Yeah.
Right there.
The news agents from Portugal. Obrigada por esta conferência de imprensa.
Podemos falar em português.
Podemos? Obrigada. Então, o ano passado foi...
Last year was a very black year for the UN. And there was a record number of civil servants that died. If a civil servant from the UN there's no guarantee of neutrality on the ground that would protect them. So my question for this year, is there any strategy in place in order to protect your workers in the field? We are going to have a meeting exactly with that goal in mind. Unlike, there are different situations. There are situations where you have peacekeeping forces on the ground, and there our motive is for a change to take place so that, because there are times where there's no peace to be maintained by the peacekeeping forces. They're organized forces of organizations that work with us in a partnership like the African Union, but with mandates for safety and with obligations in place. So I think it makes sense in the case of the Congo. That's not a peacekeeping force. It's more imposition of peace. And that's why we have had so many deaths, some 1,300 deaths, because peacekeeping forces are places where there is no peace. So to change the strategy for peacekeeping forces, that's what we're doing for those operations. Also, a series of significant measures were taken in terms of addressing the working conditions and the safety conditions for our peacekeeping forces. And there's been some success. We've had a decrease, a significant decrease in the number of people that died or were wounded. But our main concern is humanitarian workers. We have to strengthen our service, our security services for them, and we need to strengthen security service coordination with other agencies, not just in terms of direct protection, but also working behind the scenes in order to try and create safety conditions so fewer humanitarian workers of the United Nations and other non-governmental organizations that work with us would be victims, as we've seen so tragically in recent years.
Emily, then Joe.
Muito obrigada por esta oportunidade, Secretario General, mas eu acho que é melhor.
Thank you for the opportunity, but I'll speak English instead of Portuguese.
You've also mentioned the gravity of the threat regarding Rafah, where an important part of Gaza's population is now crammed and they have nowhere to go. Do you consider Israel's onslaught to Rafah, where people have been pushed with promises of safety, a war crime? Thank you.
It is for those classifications I leave for those that are supposed to classify, and namely for the International Court of Justice or the ICC. What I say is that looking into the situation in Rafah, where you have now more than half of the population of Gaza that were pushed there, they didn't go because they wanted, they were pushed there. Looking at that situation, I consider that it is time to have a humanitarian ceasefire before a gigantic tragedy develops in Gaza, if we have the same kind of intensity of military operations in Gaza that we have seen in Khan Yunis and in other parts of the Gaza territory. I mean, the same in Rafah then.
Amelie, then Joe, then Kerry.
Hi, Secretary General. Hi, Amélie Botelier from AFP News Agency. A follow-up on Rafah. You said you're particularly worried about it, but yesterday the Israeli Prime Minister ordered the army to prepare the operation in Rafah, so they seem determined to have the same kind of operation in Rafah that they had in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. So is there any kind of contingency plan for these?
Coming out of the summit, and specifically with respect to adapting the UN's toolbox and the kind of practical steps you see that would help take account of the long-term impact of the UN's decisions, which I believe are mentioned on the website as goals of the summit.
In relation to the goals of the summit, they are known. I would like, now it's member states that are to take decisions. We have presented our proposal. I would like the summit of the future to approve the key aspects of the agenda for peace. One of them, fortunately, was already been approved, the relation to support of the UN to peace enforcing and counterterrorism operations done by the African Union. This was in the agenda for peace. But we would like to see a much more holistic form of prevention. And we would like to see a number of important measures, namely in relation to the control of the new kinds of weapons and in relation to nuclear disarmament. On the other hand, we hope to see approved a global digital compact before the summit, because there we have the capacity to do so. We'll publish our proposal of code of conduct for integrity of information. We hope to have some positive indications about the reform of the Security Council. And also we hope to have a clear indication about the need for the reform of the international financial architecture. Of course, the technicalities of it are not for the General Assembly to decide, but a clear indication that we need to have a revamped international financial architecture to the benefit of developing countries that are now in a desperate situation, many of them, as you know. We would like to see approved the emergency platform to give us much more capacity to respond quickly to epidemic situations, to gigantic disasters and things of the sort. We are very interested in making forward with a number of things related to the participation of youth and women in decision-making in the process of the UN, but also in the processes in general. We are hopeful to have some indications about outer space and how to regulate outer space. We hope that it will be possible, due to the work of the high-level advisory body in artificial intelligence, to have some clear indication about guardrails, about soft forms of governance, networked, flexible forms of governance. I mean, and I could go on and on. What we want is to gain conscience that our institutions are outdated, and we need to have a multilateralism that is much more inclusive, much more networked, and much more adapted to the realities of today. And I hope the Summit of the Future will be able to decide, or at least to open the way for a number of important transformations in this regard.
Carrie?
Secretary General, hi, Carrie Norton from Le Monde, RFI and Radio-Télévision Suisse.
En français?
Oui, en français.
Yes, I'll speak in French. Is that possible? Yes, that's very kind of you. This is just to follow up on what Amelie said. How can we push to avoid tragedy in Rafah? You talked about the recent negotiations, which seem to be off on the right foot, according to Qatar, in terms of releasing the Israeli hostages. If that doesn't suit Benjamin Netanyahu, who's preparing to bomb the south of Gaza, what could stop the Israeli Prime Minister? What could exert greater pressure on him in terms of negotiations to obtain a humanitarian ceasefire? Are there tools that could still be leveraged at UN level? Or would a significant ally need to stop Mr. Netanyahu? If I've correctly read and understood the international press on the part of many friend countries and allied countries that are allied to Israel, namely the US, indications on their part that a devastating operation in Gaza must be avoided at all costs. And I do think that these indications on the part of other countries coming from Israeli allies are very important there. Moreover, the success of negotiations currently underway regarding hostages and the ceasefire, the pause, I don't exactly know the term that will be used, but the success of those negotiations will be very important in avoiding that tragedy. I think we need to do everything we can. I know that the US Secretary of State is in Israel to try and push things in that direction. That's something else that's very important. As I see it, as you are well aware, we always have said that there is a need for a humanitarian ceasefire.
Croatian News Service.
News Service. I have a question about your remarks regarding the obsolescence of the international financial institutions, like what emerged from the Bretton Woods. A, what would be the outline of the reforms that you would like to see? And B, what do you think of the role of organizations like the BRICS that are emerging as a possible challenger to the international economic order? Thank you.
Well, as you know, the Bretton Woods institutions and several others, like the Security Council, were created in 45. And they were created in relation to what the power relations and the global economy was at that time. That doesn't correspond to the power relations and to the global economy as it is today. So I think it will be very important for those institutions to reform in order to represent today's global economy, to be truly universal and truly inclusive. On the other hand, the truth is that they became too small. The paid-in capital of the World Bank as a percentage of global GDP today is less than 1/5 of what it was in 1960. So we obviously need a meaningful capitalization of those institutions, and we obviously need that those institutions reflect more obviously the interests of the global south. So this brief, of course, we would have to be hours talking about it, but this brief expose gives you the idea of the orientations we would like to see in the reform of those institutions. Again, it's not for the UN to reform those institutions, but I would like to see the United Nations Summit of the Future give some indications about the directions in which it would be good for the world that those institutions should structurally move. Sorry?
The BRICS.
Oh, I think that it is important to have a multiplicity of different organizations to support developing countries, but it is essential that doesn't correspond to a fragmentation of the global economy. I think one of the most important aspects that we need to preserve today is that one global economy, one global market, one global internet, and to avoid the fragmentation of that global economy. Within a united global economy, I think that many of these institutions can play an extremely important and complementary role.
Augusta, then Sinan, then we have to close it, otherwise I'm going to get fired.
I thought I was going to get fired.
No, no.
Secretário, muito obrigada. Augusta Saraiva. Se o senhor me permitir.
If I could, I'll ask my question in Portuguese. Just to follow up on the question about UNRWA. The United States talked at the beginning of this week about working with other partners like UNICEF, but Secretary Martin Griffiths last week was talking about the Security Council and talking about Gaza. What they do is completely dependent on UNRWA's work. In that regard, what's your opinion about the redistribution of the efforts? I'll respond in Portuguese and English because it's very important. That replacement was not possible in practice. The only organization of the United Nations which has a presence, physical presence, which is relevant in Gaza is UNRWA. Now, if we think about the situation in Jordan or the situation in Lebanon, where there are dozens of schools and healthcare centers and clinics and many activities, it's clear that no other organization would be able to replace UNRWA. But in Gaza, UNRWA has, beyond the civil servants and other people who are working in places that wouldn't be possible, well, we have emergency assistance. UNRWA has 3,000 staff members, and these personnel are the backbone of humanitarian distribution in Gaza by the United Nations. There's also the Red Cross, but I don't, and the Red Crescent, but I don't think they want to replace UNRWA. And I wouldn't have to say more about that, but there is no other organization that has a presence in Gaza that is capable of being able to respond to the needs. And then there's another factor, which is for historical reasons, which are complex in nature, The salaries of UNRWA are a third of what the other organizations in the UN pays. No other organization, if they wanted to recruit, imagine recruiting now for Gaza 3,000 people. We're talking about something that's completely impossible. The cost would be much higher if we were to recruit more people and with all the clarity, I can say it's not possible to replace the work of UNRWA in Gaza as it's done in other countries.
It's about how to, if we can replace UNRWA in the work that is done, namely in Gaza. First of all, UNRWA does not only work in Gaza, UNRWA works in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the West Bank, where the school system for the Palestinians is guaranteed by UNRWA, where the health system is guaranteed by UNRWA, where vital conditions are guaranteed by UNRWA. I don't see any other organization that would be able to do all these in all these countries all of a sudden. But in particular in Gaza, the backbone of the humanitarian distribution in Gaza by the United Nations are the 3,000 Gaza UNRWA staff members that are dedicated to the emergency response. Obviously, there are other staff members that were teaching or were doing other functions that today are not operational, but there are 3,000 Gaza staff members that are the backbone of the humanitarian distribution inside Gaza. No other organization has a meaningful presence inside Gaza, and nothing compared with this situation. So there is no other organization that would be able now to replace Gaza occupying that space. On the other hand, and that is important also for donor countries, the costs with UNRWA are much lower than the costs with the other agencies for historical reasons. The salaries paid by UNRWA are 1/3 of the salaries paid by UNICEF or WFP or other UN organizations. So any attempt of replacement that is not possible, if it would be possible, would mean a huge multiplication of the resources needed for the humanitarian action.
Sinan?
Secretary General, my name is Sinan. I'm with Ruda Media Network, a Kurdish media outlet. My question is about the Gaza war has been spreading throughout Middle East, especially we see Iran and Iran-backed groups attacks in Syria, in Iraq, in Pakistan, Red Sea. And my question is, how do you plan to help prevent this spread? And also, do you have a message for Iran? Thank you.
Well, I think it's very important that Iran plays a constructive role, doing everything Iran can to avoid the multiplication of these incidents. And I think it is also very important that we do what is being done by the UN and by others, in particular in relation to Lebanon, to create the conditions for a negotiation aiming at the de-escalation and the stabilization of the border. Negotiations are possible. I think this is achievable, and I hope that we avoid the worst. Libya and Syria and Iraq are areas where we have less capacity to be active. On the other hand, we hope that there is also a clear de-escalation in relation to the Red Sea, and we believe it's absolutely essential to reestablish the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.